Hi, I have with me Ruidi Huang and Darius Miller of SMU Cox, and we're just going to talk about their research on gender bias that they did, which is forthcoming in a top-tier academic publication. Thanks for being here. And I just have a few questions just to, see what the gist is of some of your research. You mentioned that your paper is like some of the first direct evidence that there is gender bias and that it's a channel behind the promotions gap. Can you discuss a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, it's very popular these days to document gaps in wages, promotion, various types of, even lending to different groups. And it's now generally well recognized that a gap does not mean there's bias. So the gaps can have a lot of rational reasons, from workers' preferences to the riskiness of particular groups of workers. And so although it might be sort of easy to tell a tale when you see a gap that it's due to bias, in the scientific community, it's been well established that these gaps just don't prove bias, and you need different techniques. And so in our paper, we're able to take a classic test for bias from Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize winning economist, that he proposed in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. And it turns out that there's been some recent statistical advances that just now make it possible to use this test. And so we're one of the first group of papers that examine this. And what we do is we look at it in whether or not women are held to a different standard of promotion in mortgage companies. And we have this large sample of over 70,000, a comprehensive sample of mortgage loan officers. And we can see the very first rung of the promotion ladder. And we can actually document that women are held to a higher standard when getting their first promotion at these mortgage companies.
Yeah, and I know also in the paper you talk about how in your paper it's different because a lot of work has been done and a lot of attention focused on the glass ceiling, that women aren't getting to these executive positions. But your paper is really different because it discusses this broken rung, which is sort of more of everybody, where everybody is, trying to make it. And can you discuss a little bit about your research focused on that area?
Yeah, sure. We have the advantage of having a comprehensive data set of workers at very early stages in their careers, where typically generally accepted accounting principles, you only have to disclose the very top management team. So most work has basically been documenting the familiar facts that, it wasn't until a few years ago that the first woman was actually named to lead a Wall Street bank, right? So we know there's big gaps at the top, but it's often been argued that actually the first rung of the ladder in a person's employment is actually the most important, whether they get that first promotion. And so our paper speaks directly to that. We look at the very first transition from worker to supervisor in these financial institutions.
Yeah, and I know too with that, the model, the Nobel Prize winner Becker, that one of the really interesting things about the paper was that firms that have these promotion gaps and this gender bias, that it affects their performance and it affects their long-term survival. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Sure. The idea there, and that's a direct prediction of Gary Becker's work, is firms that behave suboptimally in order to hold a particular group of people to a different standard are going to be passing up really qualified people in favor of the group that they like. And what he would argue is that's going to build up to the point where that's going to show up into performance. And we actually find direct evidence of that. We find firms that have more balanced hiring practices actually perform better than those that don't. And so this is a nice wake-up call that tells firms that if they improve their promotion practices, they'll see more performance as well.
Mm-hmm. And so what would some of the key takeaways about the gender bias, meaning bias against women, what would they be of your paper, and how is it different than other papers?
Yeah, again, so I think our paper it overcomes a lot of the last 2 decades of criticisms about these types of tests in the economics and finance literature, right? They've been roundly sort of criticized for the way they conduct the test. And it wasn't until very recently that new statistical techniques were discovered that allow us to do this without those criticisms. And we're one of the first wave of papers that's taking advantage of these new statistical techniques to identify the workers and their performance as managers when they get promoted. So there's a lot of innovations there that only were recently possible because of discoveries in the economics literature.
Also, I noticed in the paper that particularly with your the groups that you studied, that male loan officers are 15% more likely to be promoted, which leads to a gender promotion gap. Sort of, discriminating, not promoting women like might have been otherwise without such bias. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. That's a great way to sort of talk about the differences between the gap and sort of documenting bias. Because what we find is that the first part of the paper, we kind of redo the conventional wisdom, and we look at how many loans a loan officer produces over a given year, and then compare them to the people that can promote it and don't promote it. And we find even controlling for the number of loans, women get promoted less. So that's a gender gap in promotions. But the important thing to remember is that is not evidence of a bias against women, because women might turn down a promotion because they want to stay close to family, right? They may not want to move as much, right? Women may have different risk preferences. And so there's a lot of non-biased reasons why that gap could exist. And so, although it's very popular to attribute these gaps to something nefarious like a bias, there truthfully is not a lot of evidence for that. And so our paper is one of the first, especially in finance, that's able to use these new statistical techniques to go beyond documenting the gap and actually find a hard evidence for the bar being set differently for promotion between men and women. And interestingly, we find that occurs both under female managers and male managers. So in terms of what type of bias is it, it seems to be a bias that's held both by male and female managers. And that's what's called bias stereotypes in the economics literature. And it's very important because it has implications about whether or not gender quotas and promotion will actually alleviate the bias women face. And it suggests that it might not be enough.
Right. Yeah, because what you were saying in your paper is that basically both men and women were shown to be stereotyping women, and therefore they were not getting promoted as much as men, even though they performed as well, as well as men. Ruidi, did you have any color to add on that?
So another piece of result that's very interesting from the paper we haven't talked about is there's a nurturing effect of promoting more women, which I think another great takeaway from the paper is that when we find that when you put women loan officers to match them with women female managers so they work together, we see the female loan officers also become more productive. So this is another way to say, when you have a efficient promotion practices at the firms, everybody's better off in that case.
Yeah, the other thing too that was really interesting, and this gets back to Becker's model, and that was he sort of talks about how when there are these promotions gaps, it's inefficient from a labor market point of view, basically, is what you're kind of getting at, and that this is like a net cost to the economy, to society. Is kind of one of my takeaways from your paper. It's a human capital cost. Can you discuss sort of from a 30,000 foot level, what that welfare effect is that you found in your paper?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we find for this broad set of firms that we have data on, right, we can classify these firms into ones that have promoted more females over time than men employees, that have less biased practices. And Becker's central prediction is that firms that don't promote the right worker and use some other thing rather than performance in order to promote workers, right? Maybe their own tastes, right? That should show up in the bottom line. And that's exactly what we find. We find firms that want to promote a certain group of people, in this case, men, tend to suffer with lower performance in the long run. And that suggests that for a large section of firms, if we drew this out to the economy, you would in fact expect to see, large effects for firms that don't have equitable hiring practices in terms of their performance.
Right. Yeah. And I know that this is something that gets talked about a lot, like UN level discussions, about other countries around the world, that there is, sort of like women are not promoted and things like that. And
there's massive amount of new regulations being passed right now. The UK has passed a lot of regulations about sort of how you promote people, how you pay people, right? How many women say are on boards of directors, right? We have a lot of edicts now to have more equal representation. And so hopefully our work can help color some of that regulation by basically showing some of the hard evidence.
Right, exactly. I mean, you have hard data, and you have data that was really difficult to get at before, that other research could not prove out. Just last question for both of you, from your own perspective in working on this research, what was novel, or what was the thing that was the most interesting for you in working on the research? Ruidi, you want to start?
Yeah, go ahead, Ruidi.
Oh, got the low hanging fruit. Okay. So the biggest thing that I learned, is, so for me, we're economists, or mostly geeks. I'm very excited for us to see the advancement in the technique that allow us to detect this kind of bias in the data, right? Because like we talked about earlier, it's been 20, 30 years that we're not making any advancement on this front at all. We've been stopping at gaps. Now we're finally able to say there's something about bias from a statistical perspective. So that's a great thing that I really learned a lot from the paper.
Yeah. So from the wonky point of view, you found it interesting. What about you, Darius?
Yeah, I would echo what Ruidi said. The statistical techniques that went into this were just fascinating to learn. It turned out that they leveraged a weakness in the statistical techniques that everybody thought was a weakness, but it turned out this weakness actually was exactly what the test needed if you applied it in this particular case. So it just worked out. These researchers that discovered that just really it was very elegant. And I would just reiterate what I thought was fascinating is that, now that you just look at, anytime you read the newspaper, look at any of your media, it's all gaps, everybody documenting different groups having different access to capital, having different access to promotions, all these different gaps. And what our research really made clear to me is that those are not always sort of due to bias. And it turns out to be really hard to prove that it's due to bias. And it wasn't until these advancements that we could actually have some concrete evidence, because otherwise they were subject to a lot of criticisms that just make the gap not evidence for bias. And so that was the most sort of fascinating thing for me. That
these new methodologies allowed you to, in fact, hone in on that there was bias, and that you can emphatically say that there is this bias. Whereas before it was, little subsets of things that, talked around the bias, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
And if you notice, like if you look at a lot of recent research into these gaps, what we found fascinating is, like, you can see how they don't say the name. Like, no one says bias in their papers because it was well known that these gaps don't prove bias, but we didn't have a way to actually prove it up till now. And so now we have new techniques, and our data fit these techniques perfectly. And so it was a really nice outcome.
Yeah, that you were actually allowed to use the word that you were that everyone was trying to describe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just say, there's a lot of other reasons why you might see these gaps in addition to what we document. We're not saying that we are the one explanation, right? We're just saying that we are the first evidence that shows there's some hard evidence that bias at least contributes to the gap. And so we're confident in saying that.
Yeah, to the promotions gap in gender. Yeah, exactly. Any final thoughts, either of you? Anything you want to add?
I think that we covered everything.
Good. Okay. All right. Thank you for your time, Ruidi and Darius.
Thank you.